Okay, guys, so I'm here to talk to you about the idea of sisterhood and the aunts and how that is reflected in The Handmaid's Tale. And first of all, I wanted to remind you of a little bit of context. We spoke about this at the beginning of the lesson. The idea in a lot of radical 1970s feminism was the idea that patriarchy was the fault of men. And there were quite a number of feminists like Firestone who advocated a single-sex kind of society, an Amazonian society that turned its back on men. Now, Margaret Atwood in many ways is a very strong feminist, but I think one of the things that we notice in The Handmaid's Tale, she's certainly not advocating a matriarchal society either, is she? Because the idea of sisterhood is almost ironic. The language of sisterhood is used in Gilead, and women are treated in a single-sex way and placed in places like the Red Centre together. But far from this being seen as liberation, it is in fact extremely oppressive and reminiscent, I think, of the use that the Nazis had of the Kapovs, the Jews who were used to actually cooperate with the Nazis. So I think rather than Margaret Atwood seeing single-sex kind of sisterhood as liberating, she actually sees it as extremely negative in many ways, okay? So I'm starting off with the first quotation here. We've had it read to us every breakfast as we sat in the high school criteria, eating porridge with cream and brown sugar. You're getting the best, you know, said Aunt Lydia. There's a war on, things are rationed. You are spoiled, girls. She twinkled, as if rebuking a kitten. Naughty puss. I love this particular quotation here, because I want you to see that in many ways the aunts infantilize the handmaidens. They treat them like children. The symbolism of the high school cafeteria is really interesting. You'll remember that the novel actually opens in the school gymnasium, doesn't it? And she's reminded of high school dances. And I think that this is no coincidence, because I think that Margaret Atwood wants you to see this whole idea that the handmaids are infantilized. This is a very strong element of patriarchy, to treat women as though they are children. And rather than this being exclusively male, the aunts are great advocates of this, okay? Now, you might argue, of course, that the aunts are themselves subordinates of Gilead, and that their power is only given to them by patriarchy. And I think that that's quite a reasonable argument to make. However, within the lives of the handmaids, the aunts are omnipotent. They're powerful, aren't they? And they are the people who enforce the will of the state. The re-education of the handmaids takes place within the Red Centre, doesn't it? And the people who re-educate are women. They are aunts. Why are they called aunts? Well, this term is quite an interesting one, isn't it? Because they are seen as people in power, but they're not mothers. Why would they not be mothers? Because the aunts are meant to be more strict than mothers, aren't they? And I think there is a kind of archetype in literature of the sharp aunt, isn't there? She has the authority of being in the family, but she doesn't have the connotation of motherliness, of gentleness, of nurturing. And so the aunts are quite like this. And I love this element here because it tells you quite a lot about the voice of Offred and her narration. She gives it to you really so that you see the humor of it. Here, these are the words of Aunt Lydia. You're spoilt girls, again that infantilization. She twinkled. I think here Margaret Atwood is reflecting on an awful kind of feminine way of speaking to them, that twinkling. Naughty puss, the bit that Josiah and James like so much, is a fantastic little comic aside, isn't it, in which the girls, or the handmaids, in fact, it's wrong of me to call them girls because they're grown women, are referred to as little kittens, aren't they? So this condescending, patronizing tone is very, very common whenever we deal with the aunts. Now, moving on to Serena. Once again, when Offred first goes to Serena's house, we are again reminded that female figures in power can be absolutely terrifying. The notion that there will be kind of female sympathy or sisterhood is completely debunked by Margaret Atwood. "Don't call me Ma," she said irritably. "You're not a Martha." So right away, from the beginning, Serena makes it clear that she despises Offred. We know from the previous handmaid that Serena finds the whole process very difficult. She obviously, as we all know in the ceremony, has to go and put her legs around the handmaid while her husband has sex with her. Now obviously that's a very humiliating, psychologically traumatic idea. And I think the absolute genius of The Handmaid's Tale is that Margaret Atwood invents this very strange and bizarre practice that is based on a literal interpretation of the Bible. So we see, don't we, that female characters are suffering in Gilead. But does that create sympathy between them? No, it doesn't, does it? There is actually a complete absence of sisterhood. Because Serena says, "I didn't ask what I was supposed to call her." This is Offred talking about Serena. "Because I could see that she hoped I would never have the occasion to call her anything at all. I was disappointed. I wanted then to turn her into an older sister, into a motherly figure." So she wants to turn her into either a sister or a motherly figure, into a sympathetic female figure. But once again, Margaret Atwood has shown us quite a bleak view of females' treatment of their fellow females. So Offred is looking for someone to protect her, but as we know, the novel ends with Serena absolutely overjoyed when Offred is taken away, and she refers to her as a slut, doesn't she? So Atwood reminds us that women are often the most oppressive figures in women's own lives. And this is something that we can see, as I said earlier, when we look at things like FGM, female genital mutilation, etc., often practiced by women on women. So Atwood is no believer that sisterhood will solve all of our problems, far from it. Moving on to the nature of freedom now. She says here, Offred that is, "Now we walk along the same street in red pairs, and no man shouts obscenities at us." Now in some ways, this lack of harassment would be seen as liberating. It is a very strong concern of feminists that within patriarchal society, women are often sexually assaulted or sexually humiliated, catcalled, etc. But I want you to notice something here. It's almost at times like Offred misses male sexual attention. And one of the things that you'll recall is when Nick gives her sexual attention, Offred enjoys it. Because once again she feels eroticized. Her body is not just for breeding with Nick, it's for pleasure. And this is the curious thing, isn't it? That Atwood is actually showing us, if we live in such a religious and closeted world, that actually you might end up regretting it. Because this word freedom is interesting, isn't it? When Offred said, "There is more than one kind of freedom," said Aunt Lydia. Freedom to and freedom from. And guys, this is a productive quotation. This is a quotation you must learn. Because it's the whole justification of Gilead, is to take freedom away from freedom to do things. And it's more about the idea of needing to be protected. Now, a similar argument is used by Islamic feminists, isn't it? That the veil gives you freedom from male harassment, etc. I think here that Offred is actually very cynical about this view, isn't she? And she actually believes in some ways that you have to have kind of some dark forces in life. Because this desire to protect women and to cosset them and to keep them away from any kind of male danger has actually resulted in a kind of imprisonment rather than a kind of freedom. Now going on to the final box on our page, and this is to do with the whole process of testifying, which is a kind of group therapy. I've called it bonding through cruelty, as you can see over here. the interesting thing is that the women are encouraged to confess things to the group. And this seems to be following a very famous French philosopher called Michel Foucault, I'm writing his name down here, who talks about the act of confession as a way of you allowing the state to gain mastery over you, because you confess your sins just like you do in the Catholic Church, and that gives them knowledge over you, doesn't it? And this is one of the ways in which the aunts gain power within the Red Centre. They allow the woman to testify and to tell them their innermost thoughts. Janine here talks about being raped, gang raped, when she was young, only 14 years old, and she has an abortion. Now you think once again the whole idea of sisterhood, the idea here is that women might support each other and they might bemoan the abuses of patriarchy. But instead, in this scene here, all the women turn on her and they shout, "It's her fault, her fault, her fault." So they encourage to chant in this mindless way. And this is where you can get some context in, guys, because it seems to be reminiscent of a kind of Maoist society, in which there's a kind of public trial of people, and in which you have these kind of puppet confessions. And this is a very dark institution, a very dark part of any kind of autocracy. So again, Margaret Atwood is looking at different kinds of autocracies. We know that she looks at Iran, she looks at religious fundamentalism. Here she seems to be looking at a kind of Maoist China, where people are encouraged to attack the person who's confessed, and to humiliate them, and to bond through this kind of ritualistic hatred. Now, let's not forget that this is woman doing it to woman, isn't it? This is a kind of ghastly, dystopian sisterhood, is it not? Okay, now we're going to look at this scene of the burning of the pornographic books. This is one of Offred's memories of her mother. Now, in some ways, Offred's mother is a very ambiguous character, is she not? Because Offred loves her, and in many ways she is a symbol of a strong woman, isn't she? A very capable single mother. But I think Offred has very mixed feelings about her mother, doesn't she? She's quite selfish in some ways, isn't she? She seems to place ideology and politics above motherhood in some ways, don't you feel? And the person who seems to be able to handle her best is Luke, who sort of doesn't take her too seriously, does he? She doesn't know what to make of Luke, as I've shown you before, because Luke is a cook, isn't he? And he actually likes household tasks, and he's clearly the new man. And Offred's mother seems almost to resent him at times. In this wonderful scene here, we have the burning of the pornographic books. Now, this is definitely the case that, once again, this comes straight out of 1970s feminism. One of the characters who would have advocated this, a very famous feminist, is called Andrea Dworkin. She was the victim of sexual abuse herself and was a great crusader against pornography. Now, many feminists would agree that pornography is a very dark and reductive view of women, treating them as flesh, humiliating them, embarrassing them, etc. That much of the pornography is about domination and pain and sadomasochism, isn't it? Yeah. However, I think it's interesting that in this scene, Margaret Atwood is painting a very bleak picture of the auto-da-fe. You all know what that means, the burning of books, yeah? Now, of course, the auto-da-fe comes out of a tradition of religious fundamentalism from the Catholic Church that would burn Protestant literature, or you could imagine the burning of records, pop records in the deep south of America, or you could imagine the burning of communist and left-wing literature that occurred in Nazi Germany. So Margaret Atwood seems to be looking at this whole idea of censorship and showing that it is a slippery slope. And she shows Offred's mother in a very unflattering light, because it shows all of the characters there with a happy, ecstatic faces. Seems a little bit odd, doesn't it? As though they've been carried away by mob mentality. Now, this is one thing that Margaret Atwood really doesn't like, which is the communal self, the self in a group. Almost always when people are acting in common, they are doing so rather mindlessly and irrationally. So I think that this is not a very flattering image, this idea that they're ecstatic during this burning, yes? And the fact is that they're clearly manipulating the young Offred as well, aren't they? And getting her to take part and burn these books, okay? So one of the things I wanted to say to you that's really interesting, going back to the point of freedom from, as opposed to freedom to, is that Margaret Atwood shows us, okay, you want to desexualize women. You want to take away things like pornography and destroy it, but what kind of world are we then left with? We're left in a world in which Offred has sex with the commander. I shouldn't even say has sex, has kind of coerced sex, doesn't she, with the commander. And there is no pleasure at all, because they've criminalized the female body now, haven't they? So much so that it needs to be hidden away. And this is where I think Margaret Atwood seems to be aiming squarely at countries like Iran, doesn't she? Where the female body is seen as so criminalized that it needs to be hidden away, etc. So Margaret Atwood is saying to feminists, like, be careful about creating this kind of post-pornography world, because you may get something you didn't expect. Do you recall when Gilead is first formed, that it's the porno marks that were attacked first? So it seems to me to be that Margaret Atwood is suggesting that the move into dictatorship is a slippery slope. And let's not forget, in this scene, there's a really incongruent alliance between radical feminism and the Christian right. And neither of those people would like to see each other as allies, would they? And I think it's quite curious and quite funny and interesting that Margaret Atwood is representing them as a kind of unholy alliance, isn't she? Yeah? Now, moving on to the idea of participation, you'll recall, first of all, that this is a great example of Newspeak from 1984, and for AO3, it's worth you remembering that Atwood talks about reading 1984 at 11 years old and having a profound effect on her. So clearly, she's very interested in the use of language to manipulate meaning. Now, participation is usually a positive notion, a positive connotation, is it not? Yeah, it almost has a kind of democratic element to it, does it not? But in this case, obviously, it is a violent and hideous and coercive practice in which people mindlessly tear apart their victim. It's seen as a kind of form of mob justice, and within the context of Gilead, it would be presented as democratic and justice that is direct. The women who are harmed, they mete out the punishment. However, as we see here, it's described in absolutely hideous tones, isn't it? Bloodlust. I want to tear, gouge, and rend. Now, this is Offred speaking. Now, Offred is no believer in Gilead, but here she is caught up in the moment, and so it shows that Gilead is very good at having kind of psychological insight into using the idea of a mob or groupthink, and to get beyond the rational self to the hating, irrational, kind of visceral self. Now again, this is a kind of demonic image of sisterhood, isn't it? It's women together. And they are being told that this is a kind of, almost, it's been framed as a feminist ritual, isn't it? In which women can avenge themselves on men. Of course we know, don't we, from Janine later, that this man was actually fighting to liberate women. And here he is torn and, let's not forget, bitten and torn and rendered apart in some hideous ritual. So once again, a rather bleak kind of image of sisterhood operating here, isn't it? A kind of twisted sisterhood. Moving on to this nice little short quote, but which is a very interesting one. When I regain my balance and look around, I see the wives and daughters leaning forward in their chairs, the aunts on the platform gazing down with interest, okay? So it's a kind of female spectacle, is it not? And there's certainly a kind of bonding going on here, isn't it? A kind of sisterly bonding. But I would suggest that it is a little bit like the Colosseum, don't you think? That it is like gladiators. And the impulse that is bonding the woman is a sadistic impulse, is it not? And therefore, once again, we have a very kind of pejorative view of sisterhood. Finally, Janine's birth. Now, what's happened again is you could almost argue that Gilead has learned from some of the feminist teachings that women should share experiences. One of the great feminist agendas was to get midwives back, to get women to bond during times of childbirth, etc. And that's exactly what happens here. When one of the handmaidens gives birth, it is like a communal event, isn't it? They all get together and chant, and they become a kind of sisterhood again, don't they? But is Margaret Atwood wanting the reader to see this in a positive tone? I don't think so, because look here. We feel a heavy stone moving down, pulled down inside of us. So it's almost like they're all feeling the childbirth. Well, is that empathy? Is that positive? Does it help Janine? No, I think it's more like it's a kind of irrational groupthink again, isn't it? That they're hysterical, and that this is a very negative view. We are no longer single. Well, again, it doesn't feel right, does it? It's almost like they are all giving birth together. And this, again, seems to me to be quite a bizarre ritual in which woman's identity has been shaped around childbirth, almost as though this is the spiritual, the greatest element of woman's identity. And the problem with that is it fits into the idea of biological essentialism, where women are first and foremost mothers, which Gilead believes, doesn't it? It believes in natural roles, and it believes that the corrupt world of the 80s went away from nature, and they are restoring the idea that woman and childbirth are intrinsically interrelated. And now I'm going to talk a little bit about Jezebels, and you may actually wonder how this fits into the whole idea of sisterhood. Well, first of all, you may recall that the kind of bounces in Jezebels, which is the kind of nightclub, the sex nightclub for the commanders, is actually the bouncers are the aunts themselves. And these are the same aunts, of course, who are in the Red Center giving all of those lessons. So one of the first things, of course, is that therefore the aunts are complicit in the hypocrisy of Gilead, aren't they? This behavior should be condemned and considered absolutely disgraceful, isn't it? It's in fact the behavior that Gilead purports to attack, wasn't it? The sexualization of women, which is seen as so evil. And I guess this is one of the ways in which Margaret Atwood wants us to hate Gilead. Because it's one thing to be a moral Puritan. It's another thing to be a moral Puritan who's a complete liar and a hypocrite. And that's, in fact, what the commander and his fellow class are like. So it exposes the whole theme of hypocrisy, and once again, at the center of it is the aunts. So women are controlling women once again, okay? Now, Moira is speaking in this part, and Moira is a character I think that we are inclined to like. She is the counterpoint to Offred, whereas Offred is very calculated in her rebellion, very quiet in her rebellion. Is she not? Methodical and thoughtful. Offred is by no means a natural rebel. Moira is your tough, crazy feminist rebel, isn't she? And in some ways, you might be inclined to like Moira more, especially as she speaks with a great deal of personal courage, doesn't she? She liberates herself from the Red Center. And unlike Offred, she speaks with a kind of passion and abandonment, which you might find quite attractive. However, it's worth remembering that Moira, at the end of the day, ends up as a sex slave, arguably worse, in a worse position than Offred. Here, Moira very cynically understands the hypocrisy of Gilead. She actually talks about the positives for herself. As we know, she's a practicing lesbian, so she says there are lots of women around with relish. She's enjoying the opportunity for lesbianism. She describes it as a butch paradise. And notice this, the commanders don't give up a pea what we do. Why does she say that? Well, she's showing you that actually the commanders, and she goes on to say later that they're actually turned on by lesbianism. So Moira actually has a very cynical view of men, doesn't she? She kind of understands, and unfortunately the commanders actually do reinforce the view that men are rather shallow when it comes to women, are not interested in sexuality, etc. Okay? So the whole idea of Jezebel's is a wonderful idea, that this is a secret little underground place. Well, where do these ideas come from? They come from perhaps Soviet Russia, where there were brothels and expensive drinking places for the communist apparatchiks, so the top Communist Party officials. So again, Margaret Atwood is drawing eclectically on different sources and showing that dictatorship is often absolutely riddled with hypocrisy, okay, and moral inconsistency. Now, of course, this reflects very badly on the commander, because let's not forget that at this time Moira is dressed up in her absurd costume. Do you remember that it's synthetic, it's cheap? It shows the commander in the worst possible light, because he's interested in nylon, not lingerie, and it's all tired and rather despicable, isn't it? And this is a man who purports to have rejected all of these things. Moving on to our final box, while I try and block out the sun. And on YouTube, I would like to say that Mr. Griggs shouldn't have broken this blind. The historical notes. Well, this is interesting here, because this gives a kind of historical objective accuracy to the idea that women often oppress women. In the historical notes, it says, in this connection, a few comments upon the crack female control agency. That would be a good quote, wouldn't it? The crack female control agency. And this is Professor Picciotto talking, isn't it, from the historical notes. The aunts. Judd, according to Lumpkin, so you see he's using pseudo-academic terminology here to make it seem as though it's historically accurate, okay? They say that the most cost-effective way to control women for reproductive and other purposes was women themselves. So there we have it, you know, Margaret Atwood again reminding us that matriarchy and sisterhood do not necessarily end in any kind of liberation for women, okay? And as I said, this gives a kind of an authenticity to it. Also, it reminds you that Gilead is built on a kind of a cult of management as well as a cult of religion. The commander is a former marketing executive. Gilead is always looking to be cost effective. It's a kind of corporation, isn't it? And this again seems to me to be part of this unholy alliance of American Christian evangelical business sense being mixed with Christianity. Now, some of you may have seen that people like Pat Robertson, these big evangelical Christians, run business-style empires. So in particular, I think that Margaret Atwood is reflecting upon this horrible kind of corporatization of religion. You'll remember that the soul scrolls that make a lot of money, do you remember that, are actually a mechanized way of getting prayers going. And what's it all for? It's all there for money and donations. This comes straight out of the televangelist tradition of seeding, where you're asked to give money to help Jesus' cause. So it seems to me to be, once again, Margaret Atwood being very cynical about Gilead, and the whole idea in which Gilead is very materialistic, and it's all based around hierarchy, isn't it? And this idea of hierarchy, remember, is a reference to the Brave New World. Do you remember that? So we've said the two main texts, that the intertextual references are 1984, where we get things like the thought police and the angels and the eyes, don't we? The surveillance element comes from 1984. But the hierarchy kind of element of it, the idea of genetics, etc., seems to come from Brave New World. Okay, guys, thank you very much.